Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in today. For this video we're going to be going over Gambler, who, while she's a little bit less popular in the community, she was requested and is one of my personal favorites, so let's go over her and see what we're working with here. The first thing you can notice is that her power is again a little bit lower compared to something like Bud Elf at 74,000, but again I think this is a perfect example, just like Hexa was, that power almost means nothing, because she is a far better unit than Bud Elf will ever be. The first thing we're going to notice is that her health is 300,000, which is not the highest, but it's not bad. Her attack is 28,000, so it's lesser than Hexa's, but still pretty high, still high enough that once it's done synergizing with her abilities, it's going to be plenty enough to do a lot of damage, as we'll go over shortly. Her armor is 1,476. Again, that's pretty standard. You don't really see big armor numbers except for on a few tanks, and a few rangers have some outliers in terms of how tough they can be with their armor, but for the most part, most heroes you're going to see around this level. And then her speed is 1172, which means she's a little bit faster than Hexa. And it's funny that I think she's only 3 points faster than Hexa, because I'm pretty sure Hexa was 1169. So you see that even such a small difference like that can play a big role in a fight, because speed it comes down to each individual point. One single point is enough to make your character faster than your opponents, and that actually is a very big deal when you're trying to see who can beat the opponent's units first, because whoever attacks first is usually going to be the victor in terms of long endgame fights, because once you get to 10 star, a lot of these girls are capable of either one-shotting the opponent or putting them in a spot where there's no way from coming back. So her first ability deals 148% attack damage against 3 random enemies, dealing 46% extra bleeding damage for the next 3 rounds, and then this attack will also do 62% extra damage on ranger foes and heal herself for 170% of the attack. And this must hit. Now, I'm noticing this is actually quite a common theme. I imagine that this is the way they want to design assassins so that they don't miss. Assassins can't be dodged. A dodge seems to be more of a stat that's based around taking advantage of warriors and maybe rangers and priests and things like that, whereas assassins seem to be focused on making sure they land their mark. And I don't think it's too important now, but in the future, if they design more girls that are based around dodge, or if people have come up with good compositions that take advantage of the dodge stat, that could be pretty important. But for now, it's almost not relevant. But this attack does good damage. It's not the highest DPS attack in the game, but the bleed damage is nice, especially against PvE fights that are going to go the distance. If they go 15 rounds, these bleed damage is going to pick up a lot, especially in conjunction with her other abilities. Her first passive or second ability is that her attack has a 100% chance to bleed the target for 45% attack damage by each round for 4 rounds, and then she gains 16.8 armor break for 4 rounds. Now, that number seems pretty arbitrary, but I'm sure they have a specific reason for choosing such a strange number, but alas, this is what you get. And this is another good bleed damage, so again, you can see that her abilities are already starting to synergize in the fact that they want Gambler to be used as a long-term fighter. She wants to be in fights that go very long into the rounds, like 15 rounds long. 10 to 15 rounds is where you're going to see her do the most damage. And while you don't really see that in PvP, you do often see that in things like the friendship boss battles or the guild boss battles. That's where you're going to start seeing these long, drawn-out fights, and that's where you're going to see these kinds of abilities take effect. And you're going to see people who are at the top of those lists are usually going to have girls like this. Her second passive, or third ability, is increases a hit rate by 25%, attack by 30%, and armor break by 32%, and she deals an extra 85% attack on bleeding foes. And this is a perfect example of a character that synergizes with their abilities very well. All 3 of these abilities so far are all in thematic succession of having your opponent get hit with a bleed, and then having that bleed be what causes most of the damage. Once an enemy has been hit with a bleed, and then they take extra damage from her ability, even though it only seems like 148, now you have to multiply that 85% on top of that again. That's going to do a tremendous amount. And this is where she can kind of shine in PvP as well. She is a bit slow in that regard, not because of her speed, but because of the first volley of attacks, she's really just going to be bleeding the enemies. And then on the second volley, though, that's when you're going to start to see big numbers come out of Gambler, especially if you have her combined with heroes like Nani or Psychic that can multiply your damage even further. Nani with her ability to boost her allies' attack, or Psychic's ability to weaken the enemies. Specifically with Psychic, if you have Psychic weaken the enemies so they take 50% more damage, they're bled so they take 85% more damage, and then you have this ability that does 148% more damage, especially if they're a ranger, this is going to cripple the enemies. This is an amazingly good unit for fighting against ranger teams, which do become popular. You will see a lot of people using ranger teams moving forward because there are a lot of good rangers that have decent defense, decent attack, and decent crowd control. So because they're such versatile units, people generally gravitate towards them, and Gambler is a perfect way to counter them. She's usually faster than most of them. There are a few exceptions, of course, but she's usually faster than most of them as well, so she's not going to get caught by crowd control right off the bat. Her last passive is the only one that doesn't quite synergize with the rest of her stuff, and that is when an enemy girl dies, she gains health equal to 180% of her attack. And while this doesn't synergize with the rest of her abilities, it does make for an interesting passive when the fights are going long, which is what she wants in the first place. If you end up in a PvP match where it goes to 5 and 6 and 7 rounds, and you and your opponent are trading blows, picking off each other's girls one at a time, Gambler can sustain through that very well, even without a healer on her team. And this also actually makes her very well for the tests and things of that nature. Guild Wars, anything that requires consistent battles, one after the other, like hiking and stuff like that. Because she heals after each fight, chip damage is not going to be as much of a problem for her as it is for other units. So she can take these small fights, she'll take a little bit of damage in the fight from their attacks, and then as she kills them, she'll heal it back up. So while it doesn't really synergize with the bleed mechanic that she has been given, it does fit her overall role as mostly a PvE champion. And it still has an advantage in PvP, albeit a little bit less, because usually if you're going to be killing your opponent's girls, it's probably not going to matter too much that you're healing a little bit off of that. Although 180% is a nice chunk, this is rarely going to be what causes you to win a fight. Although it definitely can happen. Don't get me wrong here, it's not like it's useless, but I wouldn't rely on something like this to win fights, but it is nice when it does happen. But it does seem like it's mostly geared at PvE type battles where you have to fight multiple fights in succession, and therefore she can kind of ignore chip damage. She's not going to get hit by 1,010 damages and die because of it. She'll heal up each time because of that passive. So while it doesn't really work with the rest of her abilities, it is still a good ability. In terms of things like crystals and antiques, for crystals you're mostly going to want to go with attack or crit. Crit is specifically pretty good on assassins because their lab tree does incentivize critical damage. They don't have the same base tree that most do, where attack is like the second tree branch, I guess. Instead, assassins have one that's more focused around critical, and thus if you can boost her crit, it does go a long way. However, attack is also very good because while critical hit is good for making the attacks do more damage, if you just boost her attack raw, you'll get more value out of the bleeds and stuff like that. And of course the heals, because these heals are based on her attack stat, not on a critical strike, and these things can't critical strike. So while crit might get you more damage out of your basic abilities, I think for the overall theme of this character, attack in general is a better stat. As for the antiques are a bit of a mixed bag, because if you're paying money and you have good antiques like the one that's currently available from the decoration event that's on, you're going to want to throw that on because it has such high base stats. But basically anything that gives you attack is going to be good for PvP. However, for PvE, it is very important to make sure that you have an artifact that actually lines up with the enemy you're fighting. So if you're fighting a ranger, you're going to want to fight one that gives you bonus damage versus rangers, and assassins, one that gives you 1 damage against assassins, etc., etc. And In the early game, it might not seem that important because the antiques we get are only like 5 to 10% damage. As you progress through the game, eventually you're going to start seeing antiques that give you 90% extra damage. And, excuse me, like I was saying, when you have multipliers like 148, and 85 from this, 90 from your antique, and then potentially 20% from something like Nani, or 50% from something like Psychic, these numbers add up tremendously. And you're going to see Gambler do amazing damage, especially over the course of something like 15 rounds. But anyway, guys, let me know what you guys think. If you want me to continue adding stuff like the antique stats and stuff like that, I can definitely do that for videos coming up. However, I feel most heroes or girls are pretty much the same. You're not going to get a lot of deviation in those cases. There are some, of course, like Amazon, who should definitely be using speed instead of attack, but for the most part, attack is going to be a very big factor for almost every girl, so most go with attack. But if you would like me to just put in my 2 cents on that and how I feel about it, so let me know in the comments below. And as always, guys, thanks for watching and have a great day.